This morning, something landed on my desk that should, by all accounts, be the lead story on every news broadcast in the American Midwest. It is a number, 87%. That is the percentage of potash, the absolute non-negotiable lifeblood of American industrial agriculture, that the United States imports from its neighbour to the north, Canada. Not from a volatile ally across the Atlantic, not from a sanctioned adversary, but from the same country the current White House has spent the last 24 months treating like a trade war casualty. This is not a story about supply chains. It is a story about the structural uncoupling of North American agriculture. The narrative emanating from Washington is simple. Tariffs are a tool for leverage, a lever to force reshoring, and a signal of strength. But behind the curtain, the math tells a different, much grimmer story. In 2024 alone, the United States imported roughly 12 million tonnes of Canadian potash. It is the fuel for the corn, soybean, and wheat engines that drive the American domestic market. Without this specific high-grade flow from Saskatchewan, American crop yields do not merely dip, they crash. There is no synthetic substitute, and there is no quick-fix alternative. The timeline of the current fracture is as precise as it is damning. In December 2025, the White House signalled very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer. This was the opening salvo of a strategy predicated on the assumption that Canada had nowhere else to go. It was a strategic miscalculation born of the belief that American market dominance was absolute. But Canada didn't fold. Canada pivoted. By January 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney touched down in Beijing. This was not a routine diplomatic courtesy call. It was a calibrated, high-stakes signal of intent, accompanied by Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, the very official responsible for the province that sits on over 1 billion tonnes of potash. The delegation moved to formalise a new reality. They secured a trade framework that effectively dismantled barriers on critical Canadian exports, from canola to seafood, while opening the door for Chinese electric vehicles. Look closely at the sequencing here. The Canada-China agricultural deal was not a reactive measure. It was the final piece of an architecture designed to insulate the Canadian economy from American volatility. When Beijing agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola and solidify long-term agricultural commitments, it wasn't just buying grain. It was signalling to Ottawa that the world's largest consumer of agricultural inputs is ready to become the preferred partner of the world's largest producer. The official story in Washington frames these moves as Canadian desperation. The reality is that Canada is securing a future where its exports are no longer hostage to the whims of a trade partner that views potash as a geopolitical weapon rather than a commodity. Consider the economics of this. Before the current tensions, the potash contract for China was locked in at $348 per tonne in November 2025. While the United States was busy threatening supply chains and causing price spikes that cost American farmers $150 per acre in 2025 alone, China was locking in volume and pricing. They have secured a stable, predictable, and geographically integrated source of supply that is now underpinned by a high-level diplomatic alignment. The American attempt to replace this reliance by lifting sanctions on Belarus was a masterclass in failure. It ignored the reality of modern logistics. Belarusian potash remains effectively bottled up by European sanctions and a lack of direct port access. Signing a piece of paper in Washington does not override the hard constraints of geography and international law. Meanwhile, the escalation of the conflict in the Persian Gulf severed nitrogen supplies, further tightening the noose on American farmers. We are witnessing the final days of the North American agricultural status quo. The infrastructure, the rail lines, the export terminals, the deep water ports in the Pacific is increasingly pointed toward Asia. Canadian companies, including the giants in Saskatoon, are threading a needle, building capacity that acknowledges their American customer base while simultaneously formalizing their pivot to the Pacific. The White House continues to promise that domestic production will solve this, but the numbers are unforgiving. Fertilizer Canada has been explicit. A new potash mine is a 10 to 15-year undertaking. There is no shortcut, no magic policy, and no legislative fix that can bridge the shortfall for the 2026 or 2027 planting seasons. The American Farm Bureau Federation estimates losses exceeding $15 billion for farmers already reeling from a sector-wide liquidity crisis. When you strip away the political rhetoric and look at the trade architecture, the conclusion is inescapable. Washington has incentivized its most vital supplier to find a new primary customer. We are not watching a trade dispute play out. We are watching the permanent reorientation of a fundamental supply chain that feeds the American interior. The administration's promise of domestic self-sufficiency is a fiction that will not survive the next planting season. But the most consequential question remains: when the next contract cycle begins, and the supply of the world's most critical fertilizer is already spoken for by the giants in Beijing, what leverage will be left on the table for the American farmer? When the door to the Great Hall of the People closed behind Prime Minister Mark Carney and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, it wasn't just a diplomatic ritual. It was the closing of a strategic loop that Washington has been trying to break for years. The Canada-China agricultural deal, signed in January 2026, is not merely a trade agreement. It is a structural realignment of North American resource dominance. To understand why this is a turning point, you have to look at the deal's architecture. It is built on three specific interlocking components that shift the leverage away from the United States and toward the Pacific. First, consider the canola EV exchange. It's been framed in the media as a simple tariff swap. Canada gets relief for its struggling canola farmers, and China gets access for its electric vehicles. But that is the surface-level narrative. By allowing 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market at a 6.1% tariff, down from the prohibitive 100% duty, Carney did something much more significant than lowering car prices. He established a precedent for Chinese market participation in the Canadian green transition. This isn't about 49,000 cars. It is about establishing a joint venture investment framework for battery assembly and processing that directly integrates the Chinese supply chain into the Canadian industrial base. It tells Beijing that Canada is open for the kind of industrial collaboration that the US is currently attempting to decouple from. Second, look at the agricultural stabilization. By slashing the 84% tariff on Canadian canola seed to 15% and lifting the anti-discrimination tariffs on canola meal, peas and seafood, Ottawa has effectively restored the flow of Canadian bulk commodities to their most profitable market. For a Saskatchewan farmer, this is the difference between stagnation and viability. But for a geopolitical analyst, this represents the restoration of a pipeline. Premier Scott Moe made it clear: Saskatchewan produces over 50% of Canada's canola. By aligning his province's primary export engine with Beijing, he has created a powerful, localized political interest group in Canada that will resist any future US-led attempts to use trade policy as a blunt instrument. They now have a direct, vested interest in maintaining smooth relations with China. Third, and most critically, is the security of the potash flow. While the public statements focused on canola and EVs, the underlying intent for China is the securement of agricultural inputs. The contract volumes for Canadian potash, locked in before the geopolitical storms of early 2026, are now reinforced by this broader strategic partnership. By creating a collaborative Joint Economic and Trade Commission, JGTC, Ottawa and Beijing have formalized a dispute resolution mechanism that was previously non-existent. This ensures that if the United States continues to threaten very severe tariffs on fertilizer, Canada has a high-level, institutionalized channel to pivot that volume eastward without the risk of abrupt regulatory interference. This deal forces a logic onto the market that the US cannot counter with simple trade threats. Every bushel of canola and every ton of potash that flows toward the Pacific is a ton that is not subject to American political volatility. And the more Canada invests in Pacific-facing infrastructure, the ports, the rail, the storage facilities, the more expensive and logistically impossible it becomes to reshore those supply chains to the American Midwest. Ottawa has effectively decided that the United States is no longer a reliable partner for agricultural stability. By trading industrial access, the EV quota for commodity security, the canola and potash floor, Carney has locked Canada into an Asian-facing economic trajectory. It's a clean, efficient piece of strategic engineering. They've turned a commodity crisis into a partnership of mutual dependence. But this brings us to the inevitable conclusion of this new architecture. If Canada has successfully diversified its most critical resource dependency, and if the American agricultural sector is now structurally locked out of the favorable pricing and long-term volume security that Beijing has secured, the question is no longer about tariffs. The question is about the physical reality of the next harvest. If the US continues down its current path, it isn't just threatening a neighbour. It is presiding over the erosion of its own agricultural supply security. The future of American agriculture. Canada-China trade pivot.